Bene, buongiorno, io sono Annalisa Rolandi, CEO di UTilia e Chapter Solutions. Oggi c'è con noi il professor Fred Luthans, che è stato ieri uno degli speaker al nostro convegno sullo Psychological Capital, e chiediamo alcune delucidazioni al professor Luthans. Professore, com'è che ha cominciato il suo interesse nello PsyCap? How did you get started with your interest in the PsyCap?
Right.
And what are your research findings?
Right.
That?
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm very pleased to be here with you and to take my concept of psychological capital to the Italian business community as well as other organizations. And I've been in the field of organizational behavior for many years. In fact, my textbook goes back to 1973, when it was probably known as the first textbook in the field of organizational behavior, which is taking behavioral science to the workplace. So I've always tried to be a pioneer in the sense of taking new concepts to the workplace. And that includes then my second part of my career, after just even getting the basic foundations of organizational behavior, of course with many other well-known researchers, more so than myself. But then I tried to take behavioral psychology to the workplace. And that included my concept of organizational behavior modification, which was a 5-step model where I used to identify what were the critical behaviors that were important to performance in the workplace. Then we measured how often those behaviors were occurring, and then we analyzed what was happening on the beginning and the consequence of those behaviors, and then we did interventions. And these interventions amounted to developing people to the point where they could use reinforcing techniques to increase their performance. We had a great deal of success with that approach called organizational behavior modification, not only in the literature, in the research literature, but also in the practice of human resource development, human resource practices. At that point then I felt, wow, I've got to look at some new things, and I happened to be on the ground floor of the positive psychology movement. And that was by happenstance, as many fortuitous events happen, and that was one for me, because I was associated with the very beginning, the very first summit of positive psychology held at the Gallup Corporation in my town of Lincoln, Nebraska. And at that positive psychology summit, they were talking about taking what is right with people instead of just looking at what was wrong with people. So I felt that message that was being portrayed in the positive psychology summit, the very first one in 1999 in Lincoln, Nebraska at Gallup Corporation, that this could be taken to the workplace. And at that point I then wrote some of the first articles that actually called what I did with behavioral psychology the same way I was going to do with positive psychology, which was to create then positive organizational behavior. And then from there I developed this notion of psychological capital. And the psychological capital I felt was so relevant, but I wanted to do it the right way. And that included then to set up my inclusion criteria of what would be included in PsyCap, or psychological capital. And so I set up the criteria to be: number one, that is based on theory and research; number two, that is based on valid measurement; number three, that is based upon state-like constructs rather than trait-like constructs. The reason for that distinction is because states can be developed. Traits are pretty well set by the time someone is an adult in the organization, i.e. the typical employees that we have or managers that we have. And then the fourth criteria was that it also had to have performance impact. What variables in positive psychology related to those criteria? And so we did a thorough analysis and examination to come up with 4 components of what consists of PsyCap. Number 1 was hope. And hope is defined as both the will and the way of how we go about hopeful events to try to attain. Secondly, the second variable that we discovered through our analysis was the E, or efficacy. And efficacy is my favorite. The reason is because it has such wonderful research and theory from Albert Bandura, the well-known psychologist. It also has such impact on performance in a meta-analysis that I'd conducted that showed that efficacy related to performance better than any other psychological variable, and it can be developed. The third one that measured up to our inclusion criteria was resiliency. And resiliency is so powerful in the times that we live, because it's how we react to adversity, how we can continue to bounce back from failures, learn from failures, and even go ahead from where we started before we had an adverse situation occur. And then the fourth and final one is what we call optimism, or what the literature calls optimism. That is also a positive approach to what the future will be, positive expectations for the future, as well as making positive attributions about success and failure. So the point about this is that these 4 constructs of hope, efficacy, resiliency, and optimism, by the way, those spell HERO. H, hope, E, efficacy, R, resiliency, and O, optimism. HERO in the U.S. language, in the English language, has a nice ring to it. And I didn't set out to do that, but it just by happenstance, again, the 4 criteria that best meet what we wanted to accomplish with psychological capital spell HERO. And that's what we're after, and that's what we're now going to, I'll tell you about some of the results that we've had with this construct.
Thank you very much. But how can we get up in the future?
Right.
With your findings.
Right. Well, I think the research has been very, very positive. We've been very, very pleased with the results that we've had, because we have a measurement of that HERO construct of psychological capital, or PsyCap as we call it. We have a measure of it, and we have exciting research in all types of organizations that the higher the PsyCap of the individuals, of the teams, the higher their performance, the better their attitudes, the better their behaviors. So we have, in fact, a meta-analysis, 51 studies that we have conducted that put together into a meta-analysis, which is putting all these studies together, that we get a clear, positive relationship between PsyCap and performance, attitudes, and behaviors. And that's what is so exciting about that. This does have empirical impact. And then we go from there into new developments. And that includes developing PsyCap. So if you remember, one of the criteria that I said was that it had to be open to development, that it was state-like. So we had to prove that, which we did in our research, that these PsyCap variables put together into a core construct of psychological capital, because PsyCap as a whole outpredicts any one of the 4 components that make it up. And that's critical to know, because again, then it's basically saying that PsyCap, the whole, is greater than the parts, or the sum of the parts. So we've been able to show that impact, but now we want to say, okay, let's develop it. And we've done that. So in our studies, all published in the top-tier research journals, show that we can develop PsyCap, and that we can show that it causes performance to improve. And that's critical in terms of what we're all after, including yourself and the kind of work that you do with your company. And then for the future, I think we have some real good opportunities to look at things like wellness, because we know that work is only one part of the triangle. We have work that we know can be affected by one PSYCAP. We now have new studies that show that PSYCAP relationships are also important. The higher one PSYCAP, the better the relationships with close friends, with spouses, and in the workplace. And then the third piece of the triangle of work, relationships, would be health. And so the health component is also huge, of course, both physical and mental health. So the higher the PSYCAP, the better people have in terms of their health, the better they have both in psychological terms, but also in terms of workplace friendships, in the relationships, and then how they perform at work. So we're trying to extend PSYCAP into areas like well-being, and we're trying to extend PSYCAP into all areas of all organizations.
Okay. Thank you very much for everything.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to tell you about PSYCAP.
Thank you.
Thank you.